Welcome back to another interactive brokers video. So we're picking up where we left off regarding building the actual client library. So in our previous video, which was a while back, we basically wrote one private method that was going to be associated with our client object. That private method would be the underscore server underscore state method. Basically, the idea behind this method is it was going to save the state of the current gateway. So that way, if the user, if they ended their script or something and they have the server running in the background, then what this would allow us to do is basically pick up that active instance that we can then use to authenticate ourselves again and things along that nature. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to kind of, I would say, get the request set up. So the initial framework needed to build requests. So that way what we can do is actually make different requests in order to actually create a new session. So we kind of need to do this part in order to actually create a new session. So it's a little bit out of order if you look on the actual GitHub page, but I think this is kind of just the most, well, we kind of have to do this if we want to create a session. So with that being said, let's get started. I want to make sure I'm indented. Perfect. All right, so the first one that we're going to be creating is a private method. It will be headers. Oh, yes. And then with headers, it's going to take one argument. It's going to just be JSON, and that's going to be the default argument. Basically, this particular method is going to get the headers for a particular HTTPS request. And so it's very basic. All we're going to say is if mode equals JSON, then we want the headers to equal squirrely brackets, content type, and then next we're going to do application, and then /JSON. And then from here, we're going to say elif mode equals form. Then what we're going to do here is we're going to say we want this one to be form, because sometimes we do have input forms. And so in that situation, we want to be able to have those as well. And you want to make sure you have your little colon there. Then it's going to be x-ww-form-URL encoded. So all this method does, all it's going to do is create the headers for the request. Very simple, nothing crazy. So we have a mechanism that's going to be building our headers. Our next one is also going to be a private method. This one will be called build underscore URL. We're going to make sure we pass our self keyword. And then this one will take one argument. It's going to be called endpoint. And then this is obviously the endpoint to that we want to create a full URL for. So really all we're going to do here is build the full URL for a given request. Very basic at this point, nothing too crazy. With this one, we're going to return URL lib. So we're going to use the URL lib module. There is a parse method that goes into it, or parse object, and then it's going to be the unquote method, and then we're going to do URL lib, and then we're going to do parse, and then we're going to do URL join. And so this is going to join different parts that we can then make a full URL from. It's going to be the gateway path, comma, and then it's going to be self dot the API version. So we have our gateway path, which is basically this one right here. And then there's also, well, I'll explain that in a second. Technically, I can get rid of that. But basically, it's just taking our local host and then our, our port, and then that's our gateway path. And then with that gateway path, then from here, we basically have our API version, which can sometimes change depending on what we're doing. And then from here, it's going to be R and then portal. And then finally, it will be the endpoint. And then just like that, that is all that we need for our URL. Did I put in? Oh, I did. That's why. Sorry, I put in an extra little bracket there so that one you can just take out. But again, all this is doing is just building the URL for a given request. So hopefully nothing too crazy, right? All right, and then from here, we're gonna actually define our next private method, which is gonna be make request. So this is actually a little bit different compared to my TD Ameritrade library. So basically I have one method that will handle all the different types of requests that we're gonna be doing. Some methods I haven't actually built into it. So I think put is one that I haven't built into it. But for the most part, you can kind of see how I'm laying it out and understanding like, okay, I'm gonna make some assumptions and X, Y, Z. And really for me, I think it's worked fine, but it's basically I have a central point that I can go through that will at least allow me to catch errors and then handle them accordingly. So the first one will be the endpoint. That will initially be set to none. And then from here, we're gonna have our request type that will also be none. And then we're gonna have any parameters that we pass through, and that again will be none. And then so all this does is handle all the requests made by the client's library. And then from here, so the first thing is first build the URL. So we're going to say URL equals self. Then we're going to call that method that we built right up here. And so we're going to say, okay, now we want to build the URL. Well, what do we need to pass through? Well, we know it takes endpoint, and the endpoint is just the endpoint that we're going to pass through when we make our request. This will make a little bit more sense when we actually see a request. But again, all I'm doing is I'm flowing this piece into this piece, and then this is going to give me my URL. So at this point, I can say I have my URL. And now we have to start thinking through, okay, so how do we think about the actual request? What are the different options that we can have? Well, we can have post, we can have get, we can have put, we can have delete. And then on top of that, some of those requests will also have arguments, and in some cases, they won't have arguments. So again, for right now, I'm not going to do all of them, but assuming we want to do a post request and a get request, one with arguments and one without arguments for each one, what would that look like? Well, let's first assume we have a request type. So we'll say, okay, if the request type that's being passed through is post, and the parameters that is also being passed through is not none, so in other words, we have parameters, then the first thing I want to do is make sure we have headers for JSON data. And so what we're going to say is headers equals self underscore headers. And then we're going to say mode equals JSON. Now, technically, I don't have to pass this through because it's default. So really, I can get rid of that one. And then from here, we're going to make the request. And so basically, make the request and grab the response. So we'll create a new variable. We'll call it response. We will then call our request module, and we will call the post method. And so the URL will just be the URL that we built. The headers will be the headers that we built. And in this case, for right now, I am going to make sure it's an actual, it's verify equals false. Otherwise, we will get a warning. And so for just the time being, I do recommend that you put this off until I can figure out how to do the certificate stuff. And then finally, we're going to have data, which is going to be JSON.dumps, and then it's going to be the parameters that are passed through. Now, funny enough, there actually is an argument called JSON. And so, either one of these is actually fine. So you could do JSON equals parameters or data equals JSON dumps parameter. So this is actually an improvement that they made to the request module. Again, it's up to you. Personally, this obviously is a little bit less code, so I personally enjoy that, but just so that way it looks consistent right now with what's on GitHub, you can do this one as well. All right, so that's basically scenario one. That's what I at least call it. Scenario one, post with arguments. And then basically we're just repeating this. That's literally all we are doing. So we're going to say elif post and parameters is none. Well, then what happens there? Well, in this case, pretty much everything stays the same, but in this situation, I'm not going to have any data that I'm passing through. Our next scenario assumes that we have a get request. So we'll just do a get request. And in this case, I will assume that we do have parameters. And so in this case, I'll say, okay, parameters is not none. So again, headers is going to stay the same. And then from here, really all that's changing is we're going to just change our method to get. And then from here, we also, what is the word? We're going to have some arguments. So I'm now going to pass through my parameters, which will be my parameters that I am passing through up in the beginning. So again, that's my get request. Then from here, we need basically our final one for just the time being, which is, okay, we're going to do a get request, but in this case, we don't have any arguments. And so in this situation, again, I'm just cutting off the end. Now, for the most part, right now, looking at this, I'm kind of going, this seems repetitive. Like, why am I doing this multiple times? There's probably a good likelihood that as long as I don't encounter any endpoints where potentially I have to pass through form data, then for the most part, I probably will be able to just put this up here, but I'm working on trying to automate some of the authentication components. And so there is a likelihood that I actually will have one that will do a URL one. But again, we might be able to simplify it a little bit more. But for right now, let's just assume we want to define the headers for each different request, just kind of independently. Okay, so at this point, we'll assume that we have a response for every request that we've made. What should we do then? Well, basically, we should handle if there's an error first. And so the first thing I want to do is check the status code. And so really all I'm caring about at this point is if the response failed. So I'll say, okay, if the response, I'm gonna look at that status code property. I'm gonna say, okay, if it doesn't equal 200 initially, then what I want us to do is to print the response.url. And then I'm also going to do the response.headers. And then I'm also going to do response.content. And then I'm also going to do response.status code. Now, technically speaking, there might be some requests where we actually get back a different status code that is considered valid. So for example, on the TD Ameritrade one, there were certain endpoints where if we called them, then what would happen is it actually gives us a 201 code back. That was usually for the request that we were making towards orders. So this could technically get us into danger a little bit. The only reason I say that is because it's going to assume that a 201 code is technically a fail. So this will probably be built out a little bit more to say, okay, if it's not 200 or maybe it's not 201, then print it out. But for the time being, every request I've built into the library right now is returning a status code of 200. The only ones I think that would be really potentially not those ones are the order ones, but I'm still working on that. So we're going to leave that on for the time being. But basically all you would really be doing here is you're going to say, okay, if the status code does not equal 201, that's basically all you would be doing. So if it doesn't equal 201 or it doesn't, and really you could even condense this even more where you could say response.status code. I don't know how not in, is it not in? I don't know if that's syntactically correct. I don't know. Well, I'll just leave it for this one right now because I can't remember what it is off the top of my head. But this would be a way of getting it. Now, if it is a good request, then what we'll do is we'll say else return dot response. Now, what I'm also probably going to do is I'm going to parse it in here. So technically speaking, something we can do is, again, if we can check the headers. And so what we could say is like, okay, if the response headers come back saying it's JSON data, then basically all I would do is I would parse it before returning it back to the endpoint. So the only reason I like doing that is because, again, I really want this method to kind of be the master one, where if something goes wrong, I can easily trace it back to this one. And I've kind of built in all the functionality to catch certain things, to what is the word, grab certain information, and I'm doing it all from one location. It's not to say this can't go and grab something else, but right now I'm kind of liking it like this one where it's centralized because it's benefiting me down when I'm actually making the individual request. So probably you're going to see this one change a little bit where potentially I might be doing something like, okay, if application.json is inside the header, so basically like saying like, hey, if this is inside your response headers, then parse it, and just making it a little bit more robust. That's really the idea behind it. All right. So what should we do next? I think we might do the create sessions. Yeah, we'll do that one. Okay. So here comes kind of the big tough one, if you want to call it that. So here is basically our create session method. And so with this one, this is where everything's really kind of, I would say, happening per se. The way I kind of like to think about it is this is where we are connecting to the server, we're updating our account that's associated with that server, we're going through the authentication process, and then we're handling the situations where we might not be authenticated. So for right now, we're going to build this, but there's certain endpoints we also have to build in order to make sure that this actually works. So even though I'm going to build it, I can't officially run it yet because it actually won't let us do it. So the first thing that we're going to do is we're going to when we're thinking about our session, the first thing I want to check for is if the server is running. So if the server is running, well, let me put it like this. If the server's not running, that's kind of the easiest check. Then I want to connect and then I want to set the server. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say if self server process. Remember, this is only coming up here. So this is all coming from when we're creating our state. That's all. So we're going to say if it's not none, or sorry, if it equals none and self.connect, we will see that this is another method. It's going to return a Boolean, which is either true or false. So if the server isn't running and we were able to connect to the server, then the next thing I want to do is then make sure the server is updated. What does that mean? Well, we're going to do is we're going to define a private method that is going to be set server. What this is going to do is it's going to take the account number that you pass through to the client, and it's going to basically attach it to this session. What that means is when you are now interacting with the API, you now have an account that is associated with it. So now you can start making more specific requests. If all that works out, then we're going to say return true. At that point, we can say we are connected and we have a session running. So first, check if the server is running. If it's not, then we can start it. Then from here, what we're going to do is we are now going to make an authentication request. So what that means is we're going to say self.is underscore, and it's going to be called authenticated. So we're going to check, is this session authenticated? Check if we are authenticated. Okay, once we've checked that we're authenticated, we have a response object that's sent back to us. That's a JSON structure. The first thing we need to see is we are going to expect a key that is called authenticated. If we see authenticated in the auth response dot keys, because remember, it's just a JSON object which has been converted into a dictionary. So all we're going to first do is check, was there a key that is called authenticated? And we want to see if the auth response dot authenticated equals true, then we basically were authenticated. So I'm going to update my property for my client. I'm going to say, hey, guess what? You're authenticated. Woo! And then we're going to say, if that's also the case, then what we're going to do is we are going to set the server as well. So we're going to set the server. And then from here, we're going to also return true. So if we are authenticated, then proceed. I want to kind of clear this one up a little bit because I think it's now a little bit confusing. You will see that this one's also going to do some extra steps. So the underscore set server will also do some authentication components. So you might be asking like, well, why are you doing this twice? Technically, if this happens and then we get to this point, we're going to exit the create session function. The only time we wouldn't do this part is because we have a server process running in the background. So if it's in the background, then I can actually call this right from the get-go. And then if I can call that, then I can check and see if you're authenticated. If you're not authenticated, then we can handle that, but what we need to do is just a little bit differently. That's all. And so all this is going to do is it's assuming that we have a session. If we have a session, then we're going to check and see if you're authenticated. If you are, update the client status. And then all we're also going to do is we're going to set the server. That's all. Next, we're going to say, okay, let's assume you're not authenticated. Then what? Well, then what we're going to do is we're going to say self.connect. There is an argument that I can pass through that will say start server. We're going to set that equal to false. All this is going to do is it's going to connect us to the API. So all we're going to do is connect, but don't start the server. Don't start the server. Okay. And then, but what we do is we want to, prompt the user to log in again. So it's going to take that existing session, but it's going to ask you to log in again because you're not authenticated. And if you're not authenticated, unfortunately, I can't do anything until you're authenticated. So once you've done that, then what we can do is we can set the server again. So really, this is only being used in the sense of if you're having a server that's running and you're able to make requests. So this is really just kind of getting the session started as quickly as possible. So, different approaches, but generally it's kind of doing the same thing. And I think at this point, I've kind of gone a little far over. Yeah, 24 minutes, not too bad. All right, so at this point, I am going to cut off the video. If you have any questions, by all means, put them down in the comments below. And then in our next video, we're going to continue building on this session component. So now we have to start doing the whole create, connect. Doing the authentication endpoints, defining the set server method, all kind of the fancy stuff. So that's what's coming up in our next video. But again, if you have questions, feel free to put them down in the comments below and I will do my best to get back to them. Otherwise, we will see you in the next video.